Hi there, Jason Ross again. This is another video on using Claude to do code development. I'll provide a link to the one I recorded earlier on JavaScript, HTML, CSS based pixel game engine, sort of a Legend of Zelda top-down NES style game engine plus platformer, like all sort of 1980s graphics level game engine. And my success with getting it to develop an incredibly complex game engine with hardly any effort on my part, mostly just reusing prompts that I got it to suggest to kind of step-by-step add functionality and troubleshoot and build out a pretty robust engine. This video today is revisiting a project that I worked on last year, which was trying to get a agent or a large language model. And when I was working on this last year, I was using Google Gemini to write what's code in a language called Basic09, which is a basic variant from the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 1990s, for a number of, it's a cross-platform operating system called NitrOS9, but the platform I was targeting was NitrOS9 ease of use for the Tandy Cocoa 3 in particular. So I have been using good Gemini to try to see if I could get it to write perfect Basic09 code from the get-go. Now, the reason why this is a much more challenging task than the HTML, JavaScript, CSS engine is because of two things. One, there's not a lot of information about this programming language or this operating system or the Cocoa out onto the internet. I doubt hardly any of it has been passed through a model's training for any of these major model companies. And two, Basic09 is a variant of the Basic language. Basic was kind of the first user, like sort of, it's a combination of programming language and operating system originally. Every computer, home computer, the early days of the home computer, the 1970s and 1980s, before the IBM kind of took over, and the Macintosh to a lesser extent. Almost every personal computer from the mid to late 70s and the early 80s ran an operating system / programming language called Basic. Most of these were written by Microsoft. Bill Gates in particular wrote a lot of them. Basic09, on the other hand, was a late era variant written by Microware. I think the language came first as it was meant to target the Motorola's 6809 processor, which was a pretty advanced 8-bit processor. And then they built an operating system, NitrOS9, using Basic09 as sort of the default programming language. There are other programming languages, including you can still do assembly. There's also a C implementation for NitrOS9, especially NitrOS9 EOU. So in the last few decades, NitrOS9, when Microware kind of went belly up, the hobby group around the Tandy Cocoa kind of kept NitrOS9 going with a version called NitrOS9 EOU, and ease of use. Curtis Boyle is the main developer. If you're watching this on my retro channel, you could see some of my earlier videos about this and learn a little more. But because Basic is, even after the end of NitrOS9, Basic09, Basic lived as a professional programming language, particularly with Microsoft, starting with Quick Basic for the, once we got onto the IBM compatible platform, Quick Basic was definitely in the DOS days, and then that evolved into Visual Basic, which Microsoft was really their main programming language in the 90s. got supplanted by languages like C# in the 2000s, but Visual Basic is still around today. You can still use it, I think, in probably Microsoft Office and whatnot. And so there's a lot of training these models have on a programming language like Visual Basic, which has a lot of reserved words and syntax and functionality that Basic09 does not have. Basic09 is a much more limited BASIC. It works on a much more limited environment. So one of the things that I worked on in trying to get Gemini to write good code was I developed a couple of things in this retro MAME developer project. So in the NitrOS9 example subfolder, we've got docs and source. In the docs, I started with the Basic09 programming language reference manual, which is a scanned conversion of a PDF that's still available online for free on the Coco's archive, on the Coco archive. This is the original Microware Systems Corporation library for Basic09. The EOU version of NitrOS9 has additional Basic09 functionality, but the documentation for that is still in an alpha beta state, so it's not complete. And it does have functionality that I'm not targeting for this particular step in this process. I'm focusing on the more sort of plain Jane NitrOS9 functionality. It's more of a terminal window. It's much more akin to programming, say, on the old MS-DOS or CP/M, which is an older operating system that was cross many different computer systems. NitrOS9 kind of, or at least in its heyday, definitely fit in that space. So we're working at sort of a terminal, roughly a terminal level interface. But this document does tell you everything about both using the Basic09 editor inside of NitrOS9 as well as the programming language and all of its various functionality and syntax and how the language works. So I started with that. And then I also, as I was working on this, I created in the prompts folder here a best practices document. This isn't the version that I was working on. This is actually, I updated this at the end of my process here. But essentially, this best practices was a document I created to try and take all of the idiosyncrasies about how to write proper Basic09 code that are, especially the stuff that is definitely in contrast or in contradiction to the way that a more common programming language like Visual Basic would be, or things that weren't really documented in the reference manual itself. So I have this best practices document and the manual, and I would feed them, as well as I had some example source here. So that's this basic folder where I have a number of source files that kind of show you, in fact, especially this basic reference one, which is well-written, functional Basic09 code that is according to a style that I personally have adopted. Now, there is no official sort of right way to write Basic09 other than, it has to work. And everybody kind of has their own pet style and structure, but so my specific source code and best practices are my own personal brand of Basic09 style and structure that I wanted the model to emulate as I asked it to write new code. So again, this is my second Claude project that I set up. Just to, I go into detail on this on my previous video on the game engine, Pixel Game Engine HTML, but just to go over very quickly, Claude has the ability to create these projects, and with a project you get a few things. One, it collects all of the conversations that you have while working on a project in one shared space so that you can easily reference them and look at them. I don't think the individual conversations are aware of other conversations within the project, but it is more of an organizational tool. But the two things that I'm taking advantage of that projects have is both custom instructions. So this is I don't have custom instructions on the previous project, so this is new for this one, where I've got sort of a overall things that I want the model to be aware of when it's writing Basic09 or responding in conversations within this project. So in particular, I say treat the Basic09 programming language reference manual as the authoritative source of truth. So before you write, modify, or review any Basic09 code, confirm that all the syntax, keywords, and patterns are explicitly documented in the reference manual. So that's part of my GitHub project. Actually, before I get to that, I've attached this retro MAME developer project, which is where this code is involved. I've added on the source side, under the prompts, I've added the best practices. Just to review here, my best practices is where I've got things like, here's all the reserved words you're not allowed to use. Like I said, talking about how the models are trained on languages like Visual Basic. Visual Basic has reserved words that don't exist in Basic09, and there are a few reserved words in Basic09 that don't exist in other basic languages. So I've got lists of that. I've also got structured, again, some things that are more about like using multiple procedures, each with a specific function. I want source changes to be limited to the task that I want to rewrite source code that it shouldn't be touching. Some best practices sort of style are things like always use the colon equals. Equals is accepted, but colon equals is distinguishes assignment from comparison easily. So I want my types declared first, and then params, and then dims. Technically, if your params don't have any types, you can include your types below them. It's just there's an order in which you have to declare a type before it's referenced as a param or a variable as a dim. But for my own purposes, I'm keeping style in a very strict way because I want consistency in the way that it does things. So, like I said, some of the rules that are in this best practices are my best practices. They are not necessarily Basic09 practices, but they do the job and get the consistency that I'm looking for in the code that gets generated. I ask it to explicitly initialize variables, talk about line numbering, how to start at 100, increment by 100, reserve line 900 as the end of procedure error handler, unless it's already taken. So I give some examples. I also say try to get it to avoid using on GoSub or on GoTo, unless it's something, the only case I give it is when the selector is a contiguous 1 to n integer of n greater or equal to roughly 5, then it might be appropriate to use an on go sub to go and, based on the value, go and do different things and then return. Keep one program statement per line. You can concatenate lines using the backslash, but just for readability concerns, I want one line per instruction. Only use end line of comments to clarify, not to narrate. Lots of little things. So again, you can look at all of this stuff if you go onto my repo, and I'll provide a link for that in the description of this video. There's a whole bunch of best practices that I want to follow. I also have an error handling one that talks about how error handling should be handled. I haven't reviewed this recently, but it should pick up and use it. The combination of those best practices documents, which again, on this GitHub project, I've got those linked here, as well as there's a couple of others here, but I didn't need them for the purposes of this particular demonstration. Also, I've got this specification doc, which I use because I developed this repository and these best practices and whatnot through my experimentations with Gemini, and I got closer and closer to getting it to generate accurate Basic09 code. But even at the final stage that I left it, Gemini was still making errors, and so I just kind of got frustrated and put it aside for a while. So after my success with Claude with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, that's when I decided to revisit this to see, okay, how would Claude handle this new version of Claude, the new model, handle the exact same instructions that I had set up for Gemini? Let me show you how I started. I said, using that calculator specification. So this calculator specification was sort of this was where I stopped because I was just getting frustrated with Gemini not giving me accurate Basic09 code. But I had built out a specification with the help of Gemini for a sort of a terminal text-based calculator that could do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. I want to throw in trigonometry functions. I want to do, as many different sort of calculator things that I can do, add memory, read and write from file. And it just sort of I figured that would be a good application that would sort of, at least other than the graphical side of NitrOS9 EOU, demonstrate sort of the full functionality of developing code for NitrOS9 using Basic09. So this specification was already built. So all I did to start this conversation with Claude was say, okay, I gave it the relative path in the repository to that specification markdown document in the project's GitHub. I did find that I often have to say in the project's GitHub so that it knows to look in the GitHub repository. Sometimes it says, hey, you didn't attach that file if I don't do that. So I do find that that's a little visual syntax, verbal syntax you have to add to make sure that it is hitting the GitHub project for the files that I'm referencing. And then I said, following the examples in the source basic folder, which again, so NitrOS9 source basic, here we go. So here's all the source files. So this is all, I think everything that's in here is written using the sort of coding style and structured the way that I want. There might be a couple that have some issues, but overall this is kind of describing all of the language stuff that I want. In particular, the basic reference one, this one in particular is a good sort of a template for how to write Basic09 code. Now calc display is the end result, but let me come back here. Using that source examples is the only source of Basic09 syntax code style draft a basic calculator UI using a text window. So it looked at calculator.basic09 and basic reference. So it looked at those two files in the source and the source basic folder. It wrote this calc display. It said what it wrote. I said, okay, so one of the things that it did is that it had, instead of using if else's, it had a lot of on go tos. So I told it explicitly it's best used sparingly in Basic09, error handling primarily, use other branching logic options where possible. So after that it rewrote, which if I go to my downloads, I can show you what it wrote. So this is the first version that it wrote. And where was it doing in the, so here on state go to, and it was doing different things like this. Again, line numbers in particular start to make things harder to read and also more bug prone. So that's part of the reason. It's harder to read. It's also takes a little more time compiling, but it's the readability and the more vulnerable to making errors that you generally don't want to be using the on go-tos for most of your logic. You want to use if this, then this. So that was the first response that it did. So then it gave me an updated one, but it was using invalid end-of-line comments. So let me open that one up. So you can see here it's got here, this is not valid syntax. You have to do the line concatenation, and then actually you probably could still use that syntax, but I'm trying to train it to use the backslash and then the exclamation mark, which essentially gets replaced with REM. It's just a rem statement or remark statement when you're doing end of line comments. So that wasn't legal. The other thing that it was doing, actually it didn't do it in that one. I told it to review the best practices document in the project's GitHub and adjust your code to better adhere to these practices. So it found the procedure order, header order it had parameters of 4 types. It didn't have the right end if, and there's some weirdosity with the way that Basic09 handles if, else, end if. You can't chain else else ifs. It's if you do if else, it has to end with an end if. If after the else you have another if, you have to have another end if after that. Things, weird little things like that. Again, it was using 800 as an error handler, and should use 9. Had unused dims. Some underlying comments. So it did some cleanup, but for whatever reason, when it did that change. Maybe not that one. Or maybe it was that one. Yeah, so it started putting these comments outside of the procedure. You can't have any code in between procedure end blocks. So at the end of one procedure, the beginning of this other procedure, you can't have anything here, and it was doing this. So that was another instruction I had to do. This is why I sort of revised my best practices instructions after this. But after I gave it that instruction, the code that it returned worked out of the box. So some pretty easy to catch errors, and those are errors that happened because I wasn't explicitly referencing them in my best practices very well. The code that it gave me, which was the first time I've had an experience with a model that did a pretty complex thing, that code ran. Then I said, alter the evaluate input procedure to allow multiple operations print. So the way that it worked was it allowed me to do 3 plus 3, or 3 times 3, 3 minus 3, 3 divided by 3. Those single operation mathematical calculations worked out of the box. You couldn't do 3 plus 3 plus 2, or 3 times 3 plus 2, or use parentheses, that sort of thing. But it was, as a very basic calculator, it had memory worked, both memory store, memory recall. So this is actually functional Basic09. So inside of this calculator, we have our calc display. Actually, let's go and grab this. This is the one that worked. So we have calc display, and then that calls display main screen, which renders the sort of this here. And then it has a show menu. If you press M and enter, it'll give you this menu, so you can. Now, most of this doesn't really work, but it has placeholders for it all. And then the evaluate input is every time you type in a command and hit enter, it goes into this function and does like the addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, or it'll do some of the other things like memory and that sort of stuff. I think it might be in here too. And then it gives you errors for error checking, so like syntax error, divide by 0 is an error. So then I said add it so that it can handle multiple operations per input, including support for parentheses to change order of operations. So again, it went and thought about it, gave me some response. And the only issue it had was with this code was that it named the position variable for when it was parsing the code POS. And POS is a reserved word for the position function that takes a string and tells you the position of a character within it, I think is what it's for. Once I renamed that to position, it worked out of the box. And let me show you. So let me load up my Coco 3 emulator. Type DOS. This will take a minute. So I go into Basic09, increase the memory to 32K, load off the disk drive calc display.b09. So now it's going to load the procedures. So calc display is the run command, and then the other functions. Like I said, the only bug that I had was because I didn't have the reserved words in my best practices. So I've now added them in, and I believe it'll work. So they see all these functions. This all got written. I didn't touch a line of this other than, like I said, that reserve word change. So if I go run calc display, there's my calculator. So I can go 3 minus 3. So it tells you last entry was 3 minus 3, result was 0. I can go 3 plus 4 times 3, minus 9. So 12 minus 9 is 3, plus 3 is 6. I can go memory store. I can go and say 3 minus 2. I can go memory recall. Brings me back the memory value. I can go memory clear. You can see the memory gets cleared. So, and then go Q to quit. So that worked out of the box, which impressed me even more for how powerful Claude, this new Claude model is. I'm just going to close this. So Sonnet 4.6, especially with the extended turned on, incredibly powerful. I'm going to post this up on the Cocoa Discord, and my challenge to any of the Cocoa, I don't know, Cocoa Nuts, Cocoa friends, people that are in the Cocoa enthusiasts, I'm challenging to send something. If you want to test this out, one, you can grab all of this on my GitHub project. I'll link to it in the description of the video. But also, either in the comments of this video or on Discord, once I post this, I'll ask for anybody to send me a challenge of something that you want me to try, and I'll see how Claude does with it. Wayne in particular has been the one guy who's helped me with some of this stuff a few months ago. I'll definitely reach out to him and see what he thinks, because I may even do a video with him to see if get him to try this too, because I think certainly last year you could definitely say that models weren't able to write Basic09 code accurately in one shot. Now I think the rules have changed. As long as you've got good code examples and good instructions and you're clear on exactly what you want built, there's a good chance Claude can build the code that you want on Basic09 out of the box. Another thing I will definitely try now, I'm going to try and use the graphics libraries to see if I can get it to write graphics code. And then I'll also try and get it to write C code for NitrOS9 too, see how it does with that as well. Okay. That's all I wanted to show for this video. It's shorter, but yeah, like I said, I'm super impressed with Claude Sonnet 4.6. We are at the point now where these models can write retro code given the right content and context, and they're only going to get better. It's crazy. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Bye bye.